Welcome to the channel Life of Slaves. Today's story takes us to 1867, where a black girl stumbled by pure chance upon a giant black man left to die, chained to a tree in an isolated place. She should have walked away. Instead, she came back, and what happened next shocked everyone. This is a difficult and intense story rooted in racism, fear, and survival. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1867, somewhere deep in the backwoods of rural Georgia, a man named Samuel was being led to his death. He stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, with hands the size of dinner plates and a back that carried scars like a road map of suffering. Each line told a story of 23 years spent in chains, 23 years of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, of sun that burned the skin and cold that crept into the bones during winter months when slave quarters offered little protection. Samuel had been born into slavery in 1844. 3 years later, his mother died during childbirth with his younger sister, who lived only 2 days before joining her mother in whatever lay beyond this world of suffering. He never knew his father, though he'd heard whispers that the men had been sold south to Mississippi when Samuel was still an infant. What Samuel did know intimately was the rhythm of plantation life, the crack of leather against skin, the hollow feeling of hunger that never quite left even after meals of cornmeal and fatback, and the careful mask every enslaved person learned to wear to survive another day in a world that considered them property rather than people. But Samuel had committed an unforgivable sin in the eyes of his owners. A transgression that, in the twisted logic of the antebellum South and its immediate aftermath, was considered more dangerous than theft, more threatening than running away, more intolerable than even striking an overseer in self-defense. He had dared to look a white overseer directly in the eye. Not with hatred burning in his gaze, not with defiance or challenge, or any of the things white men constantly feared from the people they held in bondage, just with the quiet dignity of a human being who had forgotten for one dangerous moment that he was supposed to pretend he wasn't one. That single glance, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 seconds on a hot afternoon while Samuel was hauling water buckets from the well to the fields, cost him everything he had, which admittedly wasn't much, but in that moment represented the difference between life and death. The overseer, a man named Garrett Cole, had felt something crack inside his chest when Samuel's gaze met his own. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of the cocktail of emotions that surged through him. It was something worse, something that gnawed at the foundations of his entire worldview, recognition. The uncomfortable, undeniable awareness that the massive man standing before him in torn clothing and bare feet, his skin glistening with sweat from hours of labor under the merciless Georgia sun, possessed something Garrett himself lacked, and had always lacked, and would always lack, a kind of unbroken core that no whip could reach, no chain could bind, no degradation could destroy. Samuel's eyes held a soul that remained somehow intact despite everything the institution of slavery had done to crush it. And in seeing that soul, Garrett was forced to confront the emptiness of his own. Garrett had built his entire sense of self on a foundation of superiority that now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. His father had owned slaves. His grandfather had owned slaves. And the natural order of things, as he understood it, placed him above men like Samuel by divine right and natural law and the simple fact of birth. The preachers said it was biblical. The politicians said it was constitutional. The scientists with their calipers and charts said it was biological. Garrett had never questioned any of it because questioning would have required him to examine his own life too closely, to wonder what he had actually accomplished beyond being born white in a world that rewarded whiteness above all else. But in that moment of eye contact, lasting only seconds but feeling like an eternity, the whole structure wobbled. The lie became visible. And Garrett, like so many frightened men throughout history confronted with truths they cannot bear, did the only thing his limited imagination allowed: he destroyed the thing that made him feel small. The punishment was decided quickly with none of the pretense of justice. No trial, no hearing, no gathering of other slaves to witness the consequences. Just a conversation between Garrett and the plantation owner, Thomas Rutherford, conducted over glasses of whiskey in a study lined with books neither man had actually read. Rutherford was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The war had ended 2 years ago, but its effects rippled through the South like aftershocks. He had 87 former slaves still working his land under new contracts that weren't really that different from the old arrangements, except now he had to pretend to pay them, and the pretense was expensive in ways both financial and psychological. Samuel was strong, remarkably so, the kind of worker who could do the labor of 2 men without complaint. Valuable, in other words. Under normal circumstances, Rutherford would have balked at killing productive property. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Samuel wasn't technically property anymore, though the distinction between legal freedom and practical freedom was vast enough to swallow entire lives. Garrett had been insistent. "He's getting ideas," Garrett had said. "Looking at me like he's my equal. Like the war changed something fundamental. You let that spread, you let that attitude take root, and before you know it, they're all doing it. They're all forgetting their place. Then where are we?" Rutherford had stared into his glass for a long moment, then nodded once sharply. "Take care of it," he said quietly. "But do it quietly. Last thing I need is those bureau people asking questions." So on a humid morning in late April, Samuel was told he was being taken to help clear trees from a new field. He knew immediately it was a lie. He could read the tension in Garrett's shoulders, the way the 2 other men kept their hands near their guns. They walked for nearly an hour, deep into the pine forest, until they reached a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree. Its trunk was easily 12 feet around, gnarled and twisted with age, a silent witness to centuries of history. "This is the place," Garrett said. They pulled heavy logging chains from a canvas sack, chains with links thick as a man's thumb. Samuel understood what was happening. He could have fought. He was stronger than all 3 of them combined. But they had guns. And even if he escaped, where would he go? Georgia in 1867 offered no safe places for a black man with no papers. So he stood there while they wrapped the chains around his torso in the tree trunk, pulling them tight, pinning his arms to his sides. They left his legs free enough to stand, but not to walk or sit. The chains were padlocked in 3 places. Each click sounded like a door closing on possibility. "You're going to die here," Garrett said, stepping close. "Slow. Real slow. Nobody's going to find you out here. Animals will get to you eventually. By the time your bones turn up, if they ever do, nobody will know who you were. Nobody will care." Samuel said nothing, refusing to give Garrett the satisfaction of a reaction. He stared past him, focusing on a point in the distance, turning his attention inward to a place where Garrett couldn't reach. Frustrated, Garrett spat at Samuel's feet, then turned and walked away with the other men. Their voices faded into the forest, and Samuel was alone. The first day brought heat and thirst. The second day brought agony as his body began to shut down. The third day brought hallucinations. He saw his grandmother on a tree branch, soldiers marching like ghosts, the tree transforming into a ship. He was dying. And then he heard footsteps. A child stood at the edge of the clearing, a girl of maybe 9 or 10, with skin dark as midnight, wearing a dress made from old flour sacks. In her hands, she carried a tin bucket. She froze when she saw him, her eyes wide with shock. Samuel tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. The girl turned and ran. His heart sank. Of course she ran. But 6 hours later, as dusk settled, she returned. She set down a jar of water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, then ran again. The offerings were tantalizingly close but completely inaccessible. Samuel couldn't reach them. It was mercy that felt like torture. 20 minutes later, she came back a third time. She crept up to him, her hands shaking, picked up the jar, and standing on her tiptoes, lifted it to his lips. Samuel drank. It was life itself. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you." She didn't speak, but broke off a piece of cornbread and fed it to him. Then she gathered the jar and cloth and disappeared into the darkness. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, establishing a pattern. She never spoke, never stayed long, but she brought water and whatever food she could scavenge. It wasn't enough to restore him, but it was enough to keep him alive. After about 10 days, something changed. She studied the chains carefully, walking around the tree, touching the padlocks, her mind clearly working on a problem. She was planning something. That night, it rained, a violent storm with lightning and thunder. Through the downpour, Samuel heard metal scraping against metal. The girl was behind the tree, working on the chains. He could feel them shift slightly. After the storm, the chains were looser. He discovered he could now sit, a small miracle of relief. The girl returned, saw him sitting, and smiled, her first smile. Samuel smiled back. Now, with his mind clear, Samuel began to think not about dying, but about living, and about revenge. Not quick, violent revenge, but something patient and devastating. He would plant a crop of justice and tend it carefully. He asked the girl to watch for him, to bring information. Slowly, through drawings in the dirt and gestures, she did. He learned about the plantation, about Rutherford's financial troubles, about Garrett's drinking and violence, about a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Stevens who had visited. A plan formed. With the help of a small network of freed people, Clara, who could write, Moses, the blacksmith, and others, they began documenting everything, Samuel's case and other injustices. They would get the testimony to Stevens. 3 weeks after she first found him, on a dark night, Samuel worked his hand free from the chains the girl had been loosening. It took 4 hours of painful manipulation, but just before dawn, he took his first free step in 3 weeks. He hid nearby, watching. When the girl found the empty chains the next morning, Samuel stepped out. "Don't run. I just wanted to say thank you properly." He learned her name was Ruth Elizabeth Cooper. She gave him a small, sharp knife. Over the next weeks, Samuel built his network and their plan. But then Ruth brought warning. They were organizing a search with dogs. "They'll figure out it was me," she said. Samuel told her to run, but she refused. "I can't leave my grandmother." Instead, she hid him in a crawl space beneath the church, the last place they'd look. From there, he heard Clara deliver the news. Her sister had gotten their testimony to Stevens. He heard Stevens confront Rutherford in the church, threatening federal charges. Stevens wanted to meet Samuel. At dawn, Samuel went to the clearing. Stevens was there with 2 soldiers. Samuel told his entire story. "Why risk it?" Stevens asked. "You could leave, head north." "Because someone has to," Samuel said. Stevens agreed to take him into federal custody for protection and formal testimony. Samuel had one condition: the girl who saved me, Ruth. "You have to protect her." "I'll put her on the protection list. It's the best I can do." As Samuel rode away on a horse behind a soldier, he looked back at the oak tree. He had been chained there to die alone and forgotten. Instead, he had survived. He was riding toward testimony and whatever came after, not as a man being led to execution, but as a man choosing his own path. The story wouldn't end neatly. Charges would be filed but dismissed. Rutherford would die within 3 years, Garrett would drink himself to death within 5. Not justice exactly, but a settling. Samuel would live until 1889, worn out at 45, but he would die free, knowing his story had been told, that he had refused to disappear. And Ruth, grown with children of her own, would tell them how she once saved a giant in the forest. She would teach them that courage doesn't always look like strength, that mercy is powerful, that ordinary people can change history through simple kindness. Her children would pass the story through generations.